The Temple of Ascending Stars rose from the red mountains of Veloth Prime, like a frozen flame reaching toward heaven. And on this sacred morning, 10,000 pilgrims had gathered in its shadow to witness the ancient ritual that had defined their civilization for 12,000 years. High Cleric Sothon walked slowly across the polished stone floor, his forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of divine greeting, his emerald scales catching the light that poured through crystal windows above, and every eye in the massive chamber followed his movements with absolute devotion. He was old, by any standard, having lived for 200 years in service to the gods, and his voice still carried the power of absolute faith when he spoke the words that every Velothi child learned before they could walk. "We gather once more before the blade of Kethral," he announced, and his words echoed off walls covered in gold and precious gems, "to remember the promise hour, gods, made to the worthy, to remember that divine fire burns in those who deserve its touch, and to test ourselves against the weight of heaven itself." At the center of the temple, resting on a pedestal of black crystal that had been carved from a fallen star, lay the blade. It was beautiful in a way that made the heart ache, with metal that seemed to shift between silver and blue depending on how the light touched it, and ancient script running along its edge that told stories of wars fought between gods in the time before time. No one alive could read those words anymore, but everyone knew what they meant. The blade was a test, a challenge left behind by divine beings who had walked among the Velothi ancestors and then ascended to the stars. And the prophecy was simple and clear. Only one touched by divine fire may raise Kethral's edge. Sothon recited, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper that somehow filled the entire chamber. "And in their grip, the stars shall bow or burn." For 12,000 years, the greatest warriors of 100 species had come to this temple and wrapped their hands around that handle. And for 12,000 years, every single one of them had failed. The blade did not move. It never moved. Kings had tried, generals had tried, champions blessed by every religion in the galaxy had tried, and the result was always the same silence, the same stillness, the same reminder that mortal beings were not worthy of divine gifts. Sothon gestured toward the pilgrims, and the first challenger of the day stepped forward, a massive Krethian warrior with muscles like coiled steel and confidence burning in his 6 eyes. He gripped the blade with hands that had crushed starship hulls and pulled with all his considerable might, and nothing happened. The warrior strained until purple veins bulged across his gray skin, until sweat poured down his face and his breathing became ragged. Gasps of effort, and still the blade sat motionless on its pedestal, as if it weighed more than a mountain. Finally, the Krethian released his grip and stepped back in defeat, his head bowed in the traditional gesture of unworthiness, and Sothon nodded with the patience of someone who had witnessed this exact scene thousands of times before. "The gods see your effort and honor your attempt," the High Cleric said, "but divine fire does not burn within you today." From her position near the back of the chamber, a young Velothi woman named Mirith watched the ritual with eyes that held more questions than faith. She was an acolyte, barely 30 years old, and new to her position, but her mind had always worked differently than those around her, always seeking explanations where others saw only mystery. Late at night, when the temple slept and the blade sat alone in darkness, Mirith had done something forbidden. She had scanned it, sense to her at first, showing density measurements that suggested the blade should weigh more than a small moon, yet somehow it produced no gravitational distortion. Somehow it sat on that delicate crystal pedestal without crushing it into dust. There was technology at work here, ancient technology beyond anything the modern galaxy could produce. And Mira suspected that the answer to the blade's mystery had nothing to do with gods at all, But she kept these thoughts buried deep inside her mind, because speaking them aloud would mean exile or worse. And she was not ready to throw away her life for a theory she could not prove. The ritual continued throughout the day, with challenger after challenger stepping forward to test themselves against legend, and every single one walking away in failure. By evening, Sothan stood alone before the blade, performing the closing prayers that would seal the temple until the next sacred gathering, and his faith remained as solid as the stone beneath his feet. He had never doubted, not once in 200 years of service. The gods were real, the blade was their gift, and someday a worthy soul would lift it and lead the galaxy into a new age of divine light. That was the truth he had built his entire existence around, and he could not imagine a universe where that truth might be wrong. 3 months later and half a galaxy away, a Concord patrol ship detected a distress signal coming from the edge of Terran space. The vessel they found was Velethi, a cargo transport that had been reported missing decades ago, its hull breached and its crew long dead from exposure to the vacuum. When the patrol team boarded the wreck and accessed its manifest, they found a list of items that made their blood run cold. Sacred relics from half a dozen Velethi temples had been aboard, stolen property that someone had been smuggling to unknown buyers, and near the bottom of the list was an entry that would change galactic history forever. Keth 7. Blade ceremonial, status undelivered. The patrol captain read the entry 3 times before she believed what she was seeing, and then she sent an emergency message to Concord headquarters with hands that trembled despite her training. The blade of Kethral, the most sacred object in Velothi civilization, the divine test that had defined their religion for 12,000 years, was not in the Temple of Ascending Stars where it belonged. It was somewhere on Earth, and no one had any idea what had happened to it. The search began immediately, with Velothi diplomats demanding access to every Terran database, and Concord investigators spreading across human territory like a wave of desperate purpose. But decades had passed since the theft, and the trail had gone completely cold. The blade could be anywhere by now, in a collector's vault, or a museum storage room, or buried in some forgotten warehouse, and finding it seemed almost impossible. But someone would find it. Someone would wrap their hands around that ancient handle, and try to lift what could not be lifted, and the galaxy would never be the same again. In a small town in Ohio, a Saturday morning was about to change everything. Marcus Cole woke up at 7 in the morning to the sound of his daughter jumping on his bed and shouting that it was yard sale day, and despite his exhaustion from a long week at the auto shop, he could not help but smile at her excitement. Lily was 8 years old, with her mother's bright eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and Saturday morning yard sales had been their special tradition ever since Sarah passed away 3 years ago. It was their thing, just the two of them, against the world of dusty treasures and forgotten junk. All right, Marcus groaned as he sat up and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Let me get some coffee first, and then we can head out. Dad, the good stuff will be gone if we wait too long, Lily insisted, with all the urgency an 8-year-old could muster. Marcus laughed and pulled himself out of bed, his body aching in the familiar ways that came from years of hard work and not enough rest. And within 30 minutes, were in his old pickup truck, cruising through the quiet streets of Millbrook. The town was small and peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing exciting ever happened, which was exactly why Marcus had moved here after leaving the army. He had seen enough excitement overseas to last several lifetimes, and all he wanted now was a quiet life fixing cars and raising his daughter. They hit 3 yard sales before they found anything interesting, picking up a vintage lunchbox for Lily and some old tools for Marcus, and then they pulled up to Mrs. Patterson's house on Oak Street. Eleanor Patterson was 92 years old and had lived in Millbrook her entire life. But her husband, Frank, had been something different. A space salvage contractor who spent decades traveling between Earth and alien stations, buying and selling whatever he could find. Frank had died 5 years ago, and Eleanor had finally decided to clear out the garage full of strange objects he had accumulated over his career. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus called out as they walked up the driveway. "Morning, Marcus. Morning, Lily," the old woman replied from her lawn chair, a glass of lemonade in her wrinkled hand. "Help yourselves to whatever catches your eye. I just want this junk gone." Lily immediately ran toward a box of old toys, while Marcus wandered through tables covered in the strangest collection of items he had ever seen. There were tools he did not recognize, containers with labels in languages that were definitely not from Earth, and decorations that seemed to shift color when he looked at them from different angles. And then he saw the sword. It was buried under a pile of vintage lamps and old VHS tapes, barely visible except for the handle sticking out at an angle, and something about it called to Marcus in a way he could not explain. He pushed the junk aside and revealed the full weapon, caught in his throat. The blade was beautiful, maybe 3 feet long, and made of metal that seemed to shimmer between silver and blue, with strange writing running along its edge that looked older than anything he had ever seen. "Mrs. Patterson, what's the story with this sword?" he asked. The old woman squinted at him, and then shrugged with the indifference of someone who had stopped being impressed by alien artifacts decades ago. "Frank brought that back from one of his trips. Said he bought it off some trader who claimed it was special," she explained. "But it's been sitting in the garage gathering dust ever since, because nobody can move the darn thing." "What do you mean nobody can move it?" Marcus asked. "I mean it's heavy as sin," Eleanor replied. "Frank couldn't lift it. The movers couldn't lift it. I couldn't even get it into the donation bin, so I just dragged it out here on a cart and figured someone with a strong back might want it. Looked at the price tag stuck to the handle. $15. He reached down and wrapped his hands around the grip, and with a grunt of effort, he lifted the sword off the table. It was heavy, no doubt about that, maybe 40 pounds or so, the kind of weight that would tire your arm out after a while, but it was nothing he could not handle. "Huh," he said, giving it a few experimental swings. "It's not that bad." Mrs. Patterson stared at him like he had just performed a magic trick. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Frank tried for years to pick that thing up, and never managed more than tilting it a little." Marcus did not know what to make of that, so he just shrugged and pulled out his wallet. $15, right? Son, you can have it for free if you promise to take it away and never bring it back. Marcus laughed and handed her a 20 anyway, because that was the kind of man he was, while Lily ran after him, asking 1,000 questions about where they were going to put it. He was thinking it would look good mounted above his workbench in the garage, a conversation piece for when his buddies came over to watch football and drink beer. He had no idea that across the street, hidden in a rental car with tinted windows, a Velothi trade observer named Counselor Draven was watching with all 4 of his hands trembling in shock. Draven had been assigned to this region of Earth for 3 years, following up on rumors that stolen Velothi relics might have ended up in human territory, and he had traced a lead to this small town and this specific address. He had hoped to find some minor ceremonial items, maybe a sacred scroll or a blessed statue, things that could be quietly recovered and returned to Veloth Prime without causing a diplomatic incident. But when he saw the human lift the blade of Kethrall with casual ease, his heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds. That was impossible. That was absolutely impossible. The blade could not be lifted by mortal hands. Every child in the galaxy knew that simple truth. And yet he had just watched a random Terran pick it up like it weighed nothing at all. Draven's communicator fell from his shaking hands as he fumbled to send an emergency transmission to his superiors. his mind racing with the implications of what he had witnessed. "The blade of Kethral has been found," he gasped into the device. "A Terran has lifted it. I repeat, a Terran has lifted the sacred blade." The response came back within seconds, demanding confirmation and details, and Draven sent everything he had: the location, the identity of the human, video footage from his observation equipment. By the time Marcus Cole pulled into his driveway and carried his new sword into the garage, the message was already racing across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. High Cleric Sothon received the transmission during his evening prayers. He read it 7 times before the words began to make sense, and for the first time in his 200 years of life, he felt genuine terror clawing at his soul. A human had lifted the blade. A human from a yard sale in Ohio had done what gods themselves had declared impossible. And everything Sothon believed about the universe had just been called into question. 1 week after the yard sale, Marcus Cole was sitting in his garage, drinking a cold beer, and admiring the strange sword he had mounted above his workbench, when his phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had commented on the picture he posted online 3 days ago. A simple photo of the blade, with the caption, "Scored this beast at a yard sale. Anyone know what language this is?" The comment was from a professor at some university he had never heard of, and it said simply, "That appears to be Old Velothi sacred text. Where did you get this?" Marcus shrugged and typed back a quick reply about Mrs. Patterson's garage sale, not thinking much of it, and then he went back to enjoying his evening. He had no idea that his post had already been shared thousands of times, that news organizations across the planet were scrambling to verify the authenticity of the weapon, and that the Velothi diplomatic mission to Earth had gone into emergency session. Everything had changed. Marcus woke to the sound of helicopters overhead and stepped outside to find his quiet street transformed into a circus of news vans, police vehicles, and something that looked very much like an alien shuttle parked on his front lawn. "Dad, there are aliens outside," Lily said from behind him, her voice mixing confusion with excitement, "and they look really mad." A tall figure emerged from the shuttle, a Velothi male with deep blue scales and the elaborate robes of someone very important, flanked by 6 guards in ceremonial armor, carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained energy. "I am Ambassador Kralith of the Velothi hegemony," the alien announced in a voice that expected obedience, "and I have come to retrieve sacred property that was stolen from my people." Marcus crossed his arms and leaned against his doorframe, his military training kicking in despite 30 years of peaceful civilian life. Replied, "You want to tell me what this is about?" "The blade you purchased belongs to the Temple of Ascending Stars," Kralith declared. "It is the most sacred relic in Velothi civilization, stolen from us decades ago, and I am here to take it back." "Okay," Marcus said slowly. "You got any paperwork to prove that?" The ambassador's 4 eyes blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting resistance from a simple human. "Paperwork?" he repeated. "Yeah, like a police report, showing it was stolen, or some kind of ownership document, something official I can look at before I hand over my property." Kralith's scales flushed with what Marcus assumed was anger. "The blade is 12,000 years old. It predates your entire species. There is no paperwork as you understand it." "Then I'm sorry, but I bought that sword legally, from a legal yard sale, and unless you can show me some documentation proving it's stolen property, I'm not handing anything." Over. The ambassador stepped forward, with menace radiating from every inch of his body. "You do not understand, human. That blade is divine. It cannot be owned by mortal hands. It must be returned to its sacred resting place where it belongs." "Look," Marcus said with a patience he did not entirely feel, "I'm just a mechanic from Ohio. I don't know anything about divine blades or sacred temples. All I know is I paid $15 for a sword, and now you're telling me I have to give it away for free? That's not how things work here." Before Kralith could respond, a group of men in dark suits emerged from unmarked vehicles and approached with the careful confidence of people who represented serious authority. "Mr. Cole, I'm Agent Harrison with the Department of Extraterrestrial Affairs," the lead man said. "We need to ask you some questions about the artifact in your possession." Within an hour, Marcus found himself sitting in his living room, surrounded by alien diplomats, federal agents, and more lawyers than he had ever seen in one place, all of them arguing about the legal status of a sword he had bought for less than the cost of a pizza. Lily sat beside him, eating cereal, and watching the chaos with the unimpressed expression of a child who had decided that adults were all very silly people. "I want to see the blade," Cleric demanded for the 10th time. "I want to see this weapon you claim to have lifted." Marcus shrugged and led the group into his garage, where the sword hung peacefully above his workbench, surrounded by motor oil and spare parts. "There it is," he said. "Knock yourself out." The ambassador approached the blade with something like reverence in his eyes, reaching up with all 4 hands to grasp the handle, and then he pulled. Nothing happened. Cleric pulled harder, his muscles straining under his robes, his feet scrambling for purchase on the concrete floor. Blade did not move. The guards tried next, 3 of them working together with their combined strength, and the sword remained exactly where it was, as if it had been welded to the wall. "This is impossible," Cleric whispered. "The blade should not be able to rest anywhere but its sacred pedestal. It should not be mounted on a wall in some human's garage." Marcus scratched his head in confusion. "I don't see what the big deal is," he said, reaching past the struggling aliens and lifting the sword off its mount with one hand. "It's not that heavy." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Every Velothi in the room had gone absolutely still, their scales turning pale with what looked like terror, their eyes fixed on the human holding their sacred blade like it was a baseball bat. "That is not possible," Cleric breathed. "What's not possible?" Marcus asked, genuinely confused. "Lifted. No mortal being can lift it. Only gods have the strength to raise Kethral's edge." Marcus looked at the sword in his hand, and then back at the horrified aliens. "I mean, it's maybe 40 pounds. That's not nothing, but it's not exactly godlike strength either." In orbit above Earth, aboard the Velothi diplomatic vessel, a young acolyte named Mirith watched the footage with growing excitement. She had been right all along. There was something different about humans, something in their biology that set them apart from every other species in the Concord. And now she had proof that her theories were worth investigating. She began pulling up every scientific database she could access, searching for information about Terran physiology, about their homeworld, about anything that might explain how a random human could do what champions and kings had failed to do for 12,000 years. And when she found the answer, it was so simple and so profound that she laughed out loud in her empty quarters. High Cleric Sothan received a message that evening, informing him that the blade had been found, and that a human had indeed lifted it. And for the second time in a week, his faith trembled beneath the weight of the impossible. He knew what he had to do. He had to go to Earth himself and witness this so-called miracle with his own eyes. And if it was real, if a human truly could lift the divine blade, then everything his people believed about gods and worthiness and sacred destiny was about to come crashing down. The United Nations had converted an entire floor of their New York headquarters into a secure facility for Marcus Cole and his daughter. And while the rooms were comfortable and the food was excellent, Marcus was getting very tired of being treated like a museum exhibit. "Can I go home yet?" he asked Agent Harrison for the 15th time that week. "Not until we sort out the diplomatic situation," Harrison replied, with the weary patience of someone who had answered this question too many times. "The Velothi are sending their High Cleric to examine you personally, and we need to make sure nothing goes wrong." "Examine me for what?" Marcus demanded. I'm just a regular guy who bought a sword. Mr. Cole, you lifted an object that an entire galaxy believes can only be lifted by gods. You're not just a regular guy anymore, whether you like it or not. Lily had adapted to their new circumstances with the flexibility of youth, making friends with the security staff, and convincing the cafeteria workers to make her favorite foods. But Marcus could see that she missed home and wanted their normal life back. He promised himself that as soon as this craziness was over, they would go back to Millbrook and never touch anything alien ever again. 3 days later, High Cleric Sultan arrived, with all the ceremony and gravity that his position demanded. His shuttle descended from orbit, surrounded by an honor guard of smaller vessels, and when he emerged onto the landing pad, 50 warrior priests followed in perfect formation, their scales gleaming and their weapons humming with sacred energy. Marcus watched from a window as the procession approached the building. "That's a lot of drama for one old lizard," he muttered. Lily giggled beside him, and he felt a small moment of normalcy in the middle of all this insanity. The meeting took place in a large conference room that had been decorated with Velothi religious symbols, and filled with incense that smelled like burning flowers. Sultan entered slowly, his ancient body showing the weight of his 200 years, and his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the human want to take a step back. "So you are the one," the High Cleric said, his voice soft but carrying absolute authority. "You are the human who claims to have lifted Kethral's blade." "I don't claim anything," Marcus replied. "I just picked up a sword. Everybody else is the one making a big deal about it." Sultan gestured to his attendants, and they brought forward the blade on a ceremonial platform, covered in velvet and gold. "Then show me," the old Velothi commanded. Marcus shrugged and walked over to the platform, reaching down to grab the handle while his other hand held a sandwich he had been eating when the summons came. He lifted the blade without any visible effort, holding it casually while he took another bite of his lunch. Sultan's scales went from emerald green to ghostly white in the span of 3 seconds. "That is not possible," he whispered. "Yeah, everyone keeps saying that," Marcus replied through a mouthful of turkey and cheese. The High Cleric approached with trembling steps and extended his own hands toward the blade. "May I?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the words. Marcus handed over the sword, and the moment the weight transferred to Sultan's grip, the old Velothi collapsed. He caught himself before hitting the ground, his forearms straining with effort, his muscles tearing beneath his scales as he fought to hold what the human had lifted so easily. The blade dropped to the platform with a heavy thud, and Sultan fell to his knees beside it, gasping for breath and clutching his injured arms. 200 years, he said between ragged breaths. "I have served the gods for 200 years. I have prayed and fasted and dedicated my entire existence to their glory, and I cannot lift their blade." He looked up at Marcus with eyes that held the ruins of absolute faith. "You held it with one hand while eating a sandwich." Marcus suddenly felt very uncomfortable, like he had accidentally broken something precious without meaning to. "Look, I don't know what to tell you," he said, setting down his lunch and kneeling beside the old alien. "I'm not a god or a prophet or whatever you think I am. I'm just a mechanic from Ohio." "Then what are you?" Sultan asked, and the question seemed to contain all the weight of a crumbling civilization. Halfway around the world, in a temporary research facility, Myreth finally found the answer. She had been analyzing data for days, cross-referencing Terran biological information with Concord databases that had not been updated since humanity's first contact with galactic civilization. And what she discovered changed everything. Kethral was not magical. It was made of collapsed matter alloy, material harvested from the core of a neutron star, compressed to incredible density by forces that modern science could barely comprehend. By all rights, The blade should weigh more than a small moon, but the ancient beings who forged it had installed a stasis field that reduced its apparent weight to a manageable level. Manageable by their standards. Mirith ran the calculations 3 times to make sure she was right, and each time the numbers told the same story. The stasis field reduced the blade's weight to approximately 50 Earth pounds, a weight that was functionally immovable for every known species in the Concord. But humans were not like other species. Earth was a high-gravity world, nearly twice the galactic average. A planet so harsh and demanding that Concord scientists had classified it as a Category 12 death world, unsuitable for colonization. That crushing environment for millions of years, developing muscle density and bone structure that far exceeded anything the galaxy had ever seen. What seemed like divine weight to the Velothi was just a moderate workout to a Terran. The gods had not left a test of spiritual worthiness. They had left a test of pure physical strength, and humanity passed it without even trying. Mirith sent her findings to the UN facility immediately, and within hours she was on a transport heading for New York to present her discovery in person. When she finally stood before High Cleric Sophon and explained what she had learned, the old Velothi sat in silence for a very long time. "So there are no chosen ones," he said at last. "No divine fire, no sacred destiny. The blade was made by beings with technology far beyond our own," Mirith replied gently. "But they were beings of flesh and blood, not gods, and they calibrated their creation for strength that they did, possessed, but others did not. And humans possess that strength by accident of evolution." "Yes, High Cleric." Sothon closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were fixed on Marcus Cole. "What are you people?" he asked, and his voice held wonder and fear in equal measure. Marcus had been sitting quietly through the entire explanation, trying to process the fact that he was apparently super strong by alien standards, and the question caught him off guard. "Just a guy from Ohio, man," he said with a helpless shrug. "I fix cars and raise my kid and go to yard sales on Saturday. That's pretty much my whole deal." The High Cleric stared at him for a long moment, and then something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was a rusty sound, like machinery that had not been used in years, but it was genuine. "Just a guy from Ohio," Sothon repeated, "and you have shattered 12,000 years of religious doctrine without even." Marcus did not know what to say to that, so he just offered the old alien a sandwich from the platter on the table. "You want some lunch?" he asked. "You look like you could use it," and for reasons he could not entirely explain, Sothon accepted. 1 month after Mirith's discovery became public knowledge, the galaxy was still trying to figure out what to do with the truth. The Velothi clergy had split into factions that argued endlessly about interpretation and meaning, with some embracing humans as the chosen successors their prophecies had always promised, while others denounced the entire situation as an elaborate deception designed to destroy their faith. Riots had broken out on 3 Velothi colony worlds. Temples had been vandalized by those who felt betrayed by their gods, and the political stability of an entire civilization hung by threads that grew thinner every day. Marcus Cole watched the chaos unfold on news broadcasts and felt a guilt that he knew was irrational but could not shake. He had just wanted a cool sword for his garage, and somehow that simple desire had broken an entire religion. The UN had finally released him from protective custody after determining that the Velothi posed no direct threat to his safety, but they had strongly suggested that he relocate somewhere less accessible than suburban Ohio. So now, Marcus and Lily lived on a ranch in Montana, surrounded by mountains and silence, and the kind of peace that he had almost forgotten existed. High Cleric Sothon had requested permission to visit, and Marcus had agreed, despite the advice of approximately everyone around him. The old Velothi arrived alone this time, without guards or ceremony. just an ancient figure in simple robes who looked like he had aged another 100 years in the span of a few weeks. "Nice place," Sawthon said as he stepped out of the small shuttle that had landed in Marcus's field. "Thanks, I'm still getting used to it," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the house. "You want to come inside? I've got cold beer if you drink that sort of thing." They sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, two beings from completely different worlds, sharing an evening in quiet understanding. An unexpected moment of connection in a vast and uncertain world. Worlds sharing drinks and silence in the way that only tired people could. "I have spent the last month questioning everything I ever believed," Sawthon said eventually, his voice carrying the weight of profound exhaustion. "I dedicated 200 years to gods who may never have existed, and now I do not know who I am without that faith." Marcus took a long drink from his bottle before responding. "I was in the army for 12 years, he said, "served 3 tours overseas, saw things that no person should ever have to see, and when I came home I felt like everything I believed about right and wrong had been turned inside out." "How did you recover?" Sawthon asked. "I'm not sure I did," Marcus admitted. "I just found new things to believe in. My daughter, my community, the idea that tomorrow might be better than today if I work hard enough to make it that way." The High Cleric considered this for a long moment. "Your people are remarkable, not just in your strength, but in your resilience. You adapt to anything. You survive anything. You find meaning in the smallest moments of existence." "We don't have much choice," Marcus replied with a shrug. "Our world tries to kill us pretty much constantly, so we either learn to roll with the punches or we don't make it." "Perhaps that is why the makers of the blade set their test at a weight only you could lift," Sawthon mused. "Perhaps they wanted to find a species that had been forged by adversity into something unbreakable. Or maybe they just picked a random number, and we got lucky." Sawthon laughed again, that rusty sound that was slowly becoming more natural. "I believe I prefer your interpretation of the universe, Marcus Cole. It is much less intimidating than prophecy and destiny." They finished their drinks as the stars came out. More stars than Marcus had ever seen from Ohio. And when Lily came running out to announce that dinner was ready, she grabbed Sawthon's hand and dragged him inside without a moment's hesitation. The old Velothi looked startled at first, but then his expression softened into something that might have been joy. "Your offspring is fearless," he told Marcus. "She's 8, Marcus replied. "She hasn't learned to be afraid yet." "Perhaps that is also a Terran gift worth preserving," Sawthon murmured. Over dinner they discussed the future, specifically what would happen to the Blade of Kethral now that its true nature had been revealed. "I don't want it," Marcus said firmly. "I never wanted it. I just thought it looked cool above my workbench." "But it belongs to you now," Sawthon replied, "by right of lifting, and by the ancient laws that even I cannot deny." "Then, I'm giving it away," Marcus said. The High Cleric's eyes widened in surprise. "You would surrender divine power so easily?" "It's a sword," Marcus said flatly. "A really old sword made of weird space metal. But still just a sword. I have no use for divine power. I have a daughter to raise and a truck that needs new brake pads." Sawthon stared at him for a long moment, and then slowly nodded. "What would you have done with it?" Marcus thought about the question seriously for the first time. "There should be a museum," he said finally, "half on your world and half on Earth. Somewhere people from both our species can come and see it and learn the real story. Not the religious stuff or the political stuff, just the truth about what it is and where it came from." "And anyone could try to lift it?" Sawthon asked. "Sure, why not? Maybe it'll help people understand that we're not so different after all, just people doing our best in a universe that doesn't come with instructions." The High Cleric smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, it reached his eyes. "I think that is a very wise suggestion, Mr. Cole." 7 years later, Cole, stood in the grand exhibition hall of the Museum of Shared History on Veloth Prime, surrounded by alien children who stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to terror. She was 15 now, tall and strong like her father, with the same stubborn chin and the same easy confidence that came from growing up knowing exactly who she was. "Go ahead," her tour guide encouraged, a young Velothi who had grown up hearing stories about the human who broke an empire's faith. "You may try to lift the blade if you wish." Lily walked up to the display case that held the Blade of Kethral, the most famous artifact in the galaxy, the weapon that had changed everything because her dad bought it for $15 at a yard sale in Ohio. She reached out and wrapped her hands around the handle, and with a casual motion that looked almost lazy, she lifted the sword and held it up to the light. The Velothi children gasped, their scales shifting colors in amazement, and one of them tugged on their parents' robe with trembling hands. "Are Terrans really gods?" the child whispered. The parent looked at Lily, at the easy way she held impossible weight, at the smile on her face that held no arrogance or pride, just the simple joy of someone doing something she had done 100 times before. "No," the parent replied, after a long pause. "I think they might be something stranger." Lily heard the exchange and set the blade back on its pedestal with a wink at the young alien who had asked the question. "Nah," she said with her father's voice and her father's heart. "We're just stubborn." She ruffled the child's head scales in a gesture that would have been offensive from anyone else, but somehow seemed right coming from her. And then she walked back to join her school group with a wave over her shoulder. The blade sat peacefully on its display, shimmering between silver and blue, waiting for the next person brave enough to test themselves against the weight of stars. And somewhere in Montana, Marcus Cole sat on his porch, drinking a cold beer and watching the sunset, perfectly content with the knowledge that his daughter was out there in the galaxy, making friends and breaking expectations, one casual miracle at a time. He had never wanted to be special, had never asked for prophecy or destiny or the attention of an entire civilization. But he had raised a daughter who faced the universe with kindness and courage and absolutely zero fear. And in the end, that was the only legacy that really mattered. The blade could stay in its museum forever for all he cared. He had something better. He had family, he had peace, and he had Saturday mornings free for yard sales again. What more could any man ask for?